Yet there are no American troops in Pakistan. So why do you need such a huge military footprint in Afghanistan, where there is no Al-Qaeda really? They're coming in from Pakistan. Yet in Pakistan, you don't have this American presence, and yet you've actually been relatively successful. There have been no attacks on America. Thanks to intelligence, interdiction, heightened security. So Al-Qaeda isn't really a threat. You have a couple of hundred relatively unsophisticated guys. They used their A-team in September 11, and it was tragic, but it wasn't that significant. It didn't really affect the U.S. What affected the U.S. was the American response internally and abroad. Al-Qaeda isn't really a big deal, but even if you think it's a big deal, even if you think this is a huge threat that really deserves so much of our resources, understand its grievances, address them.
オバマ大統領によるアフガニスタン戦争の拡大についてです。オバマ大統領の対アフガン政策に対して警鐘を鳴らすジャーナリストでニューヨーク大学の特別研究員であるニル・ローゼン氏のインタビューをご覧ください。
Along with Andrew Bacevich in Boston, BU professor. Here in New York, independent journalist and fellow at the New York University Center on Law and Security near Rosen. He's covered both Iraq and Afghanistan since 2003. His latest articles cover the current state of the U.S. occupations in both countries, Iraq and Afghanistan. They appear in the Boston Review. Near Rosen, welcome to Democracy Now! Your thoughts after the address, the West Point address of President Obama announcing the surge of 30,000 troops, though that's not it, because though his general Stanley McChrystal wanted 40,000, he's pushing for NATO to supply the rest, and they're saying it'll be in the range of 5,000. Of course, we don't even know the military contractors that will accompany all of these soldiers.
Well, it was certainly no surprise. Even if Obama hadn't wanted to escalate the troops, he's under so much political pressure that he would have had to. But I would have at least liked to hear the words Kashmir and Palestine. If you're talking about Al-Qaeda, and the whole reason for why we're in Afghanistan allegedly is this threat from Al-Qaeda, which has been severely exaggerated, then at least understand their motives. The chief motives are the Indian occupation of Kashmir, the Israeli, American-backed Israeli occupation of Palestine. These are the motives. If your goal is to weaken Al-Qaeda, understand their motives, address their grievances. This isn't some James Bond villain that just wants to attack the U.S. for no reason. These are people who have grievances, the same grievances that have been troubling people around the world for decades. They were once explained using a secular Marxist nationalist discourse. Today it's become a religious discourse, but the grievances have remained the same. So why, if your goal is to weaken Al-Qaeda, are you attacking the Taliban? The Taliban being a local movement with a very limited and unsophisticated ideology. And Al-Qaeda exists to a much larger extent in Pakistan. Yet there are no American troops in Pakistan. So why do you need such a huge military footprint in Afghanistan, where there is no Al-Qaeda really? They're coming in from Pakistan. Yet in Pakistan, you don't have this American presence, and yet you've actually been relatively successful. There have been no attacks on America. Thanks to intelligence, interdiction, heightened security. So Al-Qaeda isn't really a threat. You have a couple of hundred relatively unsophisticated guys. They used their A-team in September 11, and it was tragic, but it wasn't that significant. It didn't really affect the U.S. What affected the U.S. was the American response internally and abroad. Al-Qaeda isn't really a big deal, but even if you think it's a big deal, even if you think this is a huge threat that really deserves so much of our resources, understand its grievances, address them. If you remove Palestine and Kashmir, you would have way less people in the world who support Al-Qaeda, who want to join it. Instead, what we're doing is increasing the occupation of a Muslim country. Now, Obama mentioned the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. He mentioned the Al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan. What about the American occupation of Afghanistan? What about all the innocent people being killed there today, thanks to American counterinsurgency, counterterrorism operations, only further increasing ethnic tensions? You're going to have a civil war in Afghanistan between Tajiks and Pashtuns at some point. It's going more and more in that direction.
What about President Obama talking about building up the Afghan forces in order for the U.S. troops to step down in, what, about a year and a half, June, July 2011?
Nobody familiar with the Afghan security forces really expects this to happen. Having spent time with them, I don't even know if it's a good thing. I mean, the McChrystal report assessment identified that the Afghan police as one of the main problems in the country. So you're going to double them? You're going to double... Basically, the Afghan police are the recruiter for the Taliban. They oppress the population. They're mostly on drugs. They're incompetent. Some of them are very brave, and they're being killed in large numbers. But you're going to double this corrupt and oppressive force? That's surely not going to win you any support among the local population. The Afghan army, meanwhile, which we spent billions on, was a failure. We saw in the Helmand operation in July. They just decided not to show up. And I was in Helmand, and the Americans and Brits were surprised and complaining. The Afghan army didn't feel like taking part. They perceived themselves more as a force designed for external threats, not for internal purposes. So that's a complete waste. And they also just don't have the ability. They're also dominated by Tajiks and Uzbeks, and they're fighting Pashtuns. You're going to see this force break down on along ethnic lines. We see the increase or the return of ethnic-based militias throughout the country. One other mistake, I think, in the American approach is this focus on the South. A constant focus on the South, as if there's no problems anywhere else in the country. This focus on the South allowed the center to fall. So you have Logar and Wardak, two provinces who are adjacent to Kabul, that fell in the last year to Taliban control thanks to the American obsession with the South. You have Kunduz and other parts of the North falling to the Taliban thanks to this American obsession with the South.
Finally, Professor Bacevich, your book is called The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, responding to what Nir Rosen has said and President Obama's last point about why we are in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think the president's sort of a capsule description of modern U.S. history and our role in the world is extraordinarily important. And the reason it's important is because that text could have been lifted out of a speech by Harry Truman, by John Kennedy, by Lyndon Johnson, by Richard Nixon, by Ronald Reagan, or by George W. Bush. This is the preferred narrative of American history, the way we prefer to see ourselves, and therefore the narrative that we use to justify all that we do in the world. It is really telling and extraordinary that this president, whose background is quite different from all those other presidents that I just named, and who came to office promising to bring about change, it's extraordinary that he himself would now embrace that narrative so uncritically. And I think that that is indicative of the extent to which, whether there's going to be any change in Washington, it's simply going to be changes on the margins, and that the Washington consensus, the status quo, is firmly in place.
Comment, Nir Rosen, on what you think, if you were standing at West Point last night, you would have been saying.
I would have mentioned Kashmir and Palestine and the history of American support for dictatorships in the Middle East and the Muslim world as the cause for this al-Qaeda phenomenon, for this resentment of the U.S., and I would have...
And the actions you would have announced?
This is impossibly naive. They require a revolution in the way America does business. But stop supporting the dictatorships in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and elsewhere. Stop supporting the Pakistani dictatorship or quasi-dictatorship. Stop supporting Israeli occupation of Palestine. Be perceived as a fair player in the Middle East and the Muslim world. Stop killing Muslims. Muslims will not want to kill you. It's really very easy.
Nir Rosen, independent journalist, recently back from Afghanistan, has been covering Afghanistan and Iraq since 2003, a fellow at NYU Center on Law and Security, and thank you very much.
罪のない民間人を無差別に殺害し、人権を踏みにじる現実こそが憎しみの連鎖をもたらし、ひいてはアメリカはイスラムの敵だという意識をイスラム教徒に広げる理由の一つになってしまっているのではないでしょうか。憎しみの連鎖はどうすれば断つことができるのか。まずは民間人を巻き添えにするような軍事作戦を改善するとともに、民間人を殺害した人を確実に処罰するための法的枠組みをしっかり構築することなどを通じて、憎しみの連鎖を断つ努力をすることが求められているのではないでしょうか。